Hi, we entered in 2 Samuel 12 today, continuing the unit that began at the beginning of chapter 11. As I noted in the last video, there isn't even a closing of a sentence between the two chapters, as you can see on the left side of the screen. So we've been going through some of these issues that follow us throughout this entire unit, and we began with these overall issues that I addressed in the introductory video to this unit. If you haven't watched that yet, I really encourage you to do so you can get some sense of how these two chapters fit into the larger narrative of the rise and fall of David. So now we're on chapter 12, and as we begin to enter this, everything seems to change. And let's look at the structure that I've been following here. It's not the only structure, that's why I note a structure, but the key element, as I've been emphasizing, is the framing around the war at the beginning and at the end, which also intruded in the place that Uriah was sent to die. And now we're beginning in chapter 12. And although there are parallels that form a chiastic-like shape, what you can see is the characters, other than David, are completely different. On chapter 11, it was David and Bathsheba, and then it was David and Uriah, and then it was David and Joab. But now, it's Nathan and David and Yahweh throughout. Joab's not here, Uriah is dead, and Bathsheba will only appear at the very end. So it completely changes perspective as we move into the new chapter here. And there are a number of key words, some of which continue from chapter 11. I did them separately because they really follow certain units rather than whole chapters. Here we see this, and around take and man, I'll show you another little unit that focuses just on the 4 verses that we're going to look at today. Then there's this little chiastic shape here when Nathan interprets the parable, which we'll look at next time. And then another large chiasm here around the aftermath, and we see a number of parallels there, including these phrases that are repeated over and over again about eating or fasting there. And then it comes down to the closing scene. So those are the key words, and we'll be following that as we do. But one thing I really want to note is how suddenly this chapter opens a scene completely out of nowhere. What we'd been following here, and you look at the last verse of chapter 11 so you can see, after Uriah is dead and the Joab and the messenger business is completed, we get this little summary. When the morning was over, David sent and brought her, of course, Bathsheba, to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. And suddenly out of nowhere, really the out of nowhere starts here, the thing that David had done was evil in the eyes of Yahweh. And that's the literal meaning of it there, paralleling the flip side of that, where David sent in the message to Joab, do not let this thing be evil in your eyes. So it is evil in the eyes of Yahweh. And if we're Yahwists rather than David partisans, we might have been wondering throughout this chapter, where is Yahweh? Is Yahweh, who has been shaping David, who David claims he relies on, going to intervene and protect Bathsheba or Uriah? No, that doesn't happen. God in the book of Samuel does not necessarily intervene to save people in those situations, and obviously lots of people die. But Yahweh intervenes here in a way that's incredibly mysterious. And I want to bring up what I was just mentioning a moment ago of this focus on our 4 verses, highlighting the key words, but then I want to look at something about the narrative context that's very strange. And so we see, translating this as literally as I can, the New RSV over here does not do that. Notice 1 city, 1 rich, and 1 poor. We lose that there. And obviously the contrast between the rich and the poor. But notice in verse 4, 3 different ways that the extra person is referred to as a traveler, helek, using a word unique here in the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text. And then Hamal here, which is one other time. It's not that unusual. But then wayfarer is the second way this person is called, and you can't pronounce that without vowels, but only one other time in the whole Deuteronomistic history from Joshua to 2 Kings. And then simply the man. So 3 different ways to refer to this person. And as we look at the story itself, we're going to see there are many aspects of the internal story that don't really correspond to what has just happened. And we're going to have to look at that as we go, both in this video and in the next one. But as we do, let's just consider what we hear in the very first line. Yahweh sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said. So a lot of things to consider there. And I can put up some of the issues here. I didn't necessarily bring this point I'm going to bring up right here, but I am bringing up this point. What do we imagine Nathan knows? Now by this time Bathsheba has had a child, and we don't know where Nathan lives. Does he live in the palace? Does he live somewhere else? We really know nothing about him. He appeared in chapter 7 with the oracle from Yahweh to promise that one of David's offspring would be on the throne in Jerusalem forever. A fact which is plainly not true by the end of 2 Kings, when the monarchy ends and the elite go into exile in Babylon. But that promise was kept in the background all the way through the time of Jesus, which is, of course, why Jesus is understood as a son of David if he's going to be king in many ways. But we haven't heard from Nathan since chapter 7, and here he just appears out of nowhere. Notice he's not described as a prophet, he's just Nathan. And we don't know what the experience between Yahweh and Nathan was. When it was Samuel being sent to Saul, we sometimes heard Yahweh and Samuel talk to each other. And in fact, we heard Samuel grumble to Yahweh about the request for a king, and Yahweh telling him, it's not about you, Samuel, but here's what you should say. And he's given the words, and then he repeats them. But we know nothing of that here. David's prophet Nathan is much more of a cipher than Saul's prophet Samuel was. And it's not that Saul wanted Samuel to be prophet necessarily. He was utterly dependent on Samuel, who anointed him king and was the vehicle for maintaining his power amongst the people. But we know nothing about Nathan's relationship with anybody else at all. We'll find out in 1 Kings that he's a partisan of Bathsheba and Solomon, and we'll look at the question of why that might be then. But for now, he just appears. And so one thing we clearly don't know, and it's really important here, is the story that comes something that Yahweh told him, or is it Nathan making this up? Did Yahweh tell him, go and tell David I'm pissed at him? And he doesn't, instead he tells a story? Are we to expect that Yahweh told this very story? If it was, why wouldn't it say so? And if I scroll down a little bit, you can see that after the parable and after David's response, we hear Nathan says explicitly, thus says Yahweh, I anointed you king. So there Nathan is plainly quoting Yahweh, understanding, as far as we can tell, that that word was given to him earlier, that this isn't just a live experience of Yahweh telling him this. This is part of the initial encounter that's hidden here behind the Yahweh sent Nathan to David. But we don't know that. But the contrast between the explicit quoting from Yahweh there and telling this story without it being linked to Yahweh leaves open the question of whether this is Nathan's strategic effort here to try to trick David into responding so that he, like the messenger, doesn't get blamed for it, or is it directly from Yahweh? We just don't know. Let's look at the words of the parable a little bit in this form and as we go through it, because there are many things about this story that are very, very strange. It's certainly not realistic in any way, and yet David takes it as if it's a real story. Scholars argue about whether it's a parable or not. It doesn't say it's a parable, and if it was told as a parable, that would obviate David's anger down here. They would just discuss it as a story. But plainly it's being told as if it's real. And again, in the context with Nathan and David, it seems to come out of nowhere. Nathan doesn't just show up and there's no small talk. When Uriah showed up from the front at Rabbah, at least the narrator told us David asked about the shalom of the war and of the people and of Joab. But there's no small talk here. Nathan just suddenly appears out of nowhere and says, there were 2 men in a certain city. He doesn't say, "O David, O Lord King," or "May I talk to you," or anything. So the introduction is very strange, and we hear nothing about David being there or what David thinks of Nathan talking to him. It's just all left blank. So there were 2 men in one city. What city? Why does it have to be a city? We don't know. If we take this as an allegory and we want to look at it that way from the beginning, we can take this as Jerusalem. But does it matter to the story? You can decide for yourself. One rich and one poor. The word for rich is only in this passage in the entire Deuteronomistic history and 3 times in our story here, as you can see. And the other poor. And the word for poor, Rash, here is only one other time in the Deuteronomistic history outside this passage, and there it's for David. I didn't highlight those as unique words as I did some of these unique words here. I could have, but you can see it here. There are other words for rich and poor. Patakos is, that's Greek. Sorry about that. Anawim is the word for the holy poor, and that's not the word that's used here. So unusual words, and that leads some scholars to ask about questions and sources, but we don't need to look at that. So we have a situation, one rich man and one poor man. Notice right now how the setup is parallel to the story in 1 Kings 3 about the 2 women in one house. And as I treat that, as I did in my book, Come Out My People, I treat that as an allegory about Israel and Judah and the monarchy. But it's interesting how all scholars see this as some kind of parable, or at least a symbolic story, but very few have seen that story in that role. And I want to suggest they're the same kind of story told for very similar purposes, so readers can get a deeper idea of what's going on. So just pay attention to how this story is told, and we'll look at that more when we get to 1 Kings. So the rich man, literally the rich one here, we'll follow it here, had a great increase. It's not just that he had large flocks, he had a great increase, which perhaps echoes Jacob and his flocks increasing when he was with Laban in Genesis. But the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb. The word for ewe lamb is kevasah here. It's only in this scene in Deuteronomistic History. But it's 3 times in Genesis 21, 28 to 30 here about Abimelech and Abraham and the ewe lambs that you can see here as a witness to the well. There it has to do with calling the well Beersheba, 7 for Sheba here, and beer for the well. So that could be a word play there. But this is not about Beersheba in this context. As Koenig notes below, David the shepherd was one who ought to know how to care for the sheep. But this is what happens with the poor man. He had bought the sheep, which implicitly suggested the rich man had inherited his flocks, that he had not bought them, but they were already his. And he literally, not literally, he brought it up here, but the literal's over here. It lived and became great with him and his children. And the grew up with him is misleading here. It's not that he and the family grew up together. The ewe lamb grew up with him and his children. And then we hear something really strange. It ate of, Norsvi has his meager fare, but as some people suggest, a crust. Robert Alter suggests from the crust he would eat. Another one from his morsel he would eat, and so I translated here as morsels here, which is how it plays out in 1 Samuel 2:36, the only other use in Samuel. And it drank from his cup. Now, it's one thing to see a ewe lamb eating his fare. A ewe lamb could eat a piece of bread, I suppose, although lambs tend to eat grass, don't they? But I suppose he could eat that. But drinking from his cup, no. Now the story is getting very strange. The verb used here for drink is only here in the Deuteronomistic History, other than one other place. And the word for cup, the word for cup is only here in the Deuteronomistic History in one other place. Drink is a normal word for drink. And then really strange, lie in his bosom. And if we want to be a little bit less incestuous sounding about that, or bestiality sounding about it, we could say in his lap, which would perhaps make more sense about a lamb lying in his lap. But either way, it's very strange and raises all kinds of odd questions. But in my note, you can see what it's implying here in the first use of the word chik for bosom or lap is it will be Abishag, who's the young, beautiful woman who lies with David to keep him warm and is the object of lusty or at least political sexual attraction, as we'll see there from others. And then the prostitute mothers in the very story that I was just suggesting may be parallel with this. And in verse 8, it's implicitly linked with Saul's wife and daughters, which you can't quite see the verse down here, but I gave you your master's house and your master's women. And so, in that sense, a Hinnom. So, is this a symbol for a Hinnom? Well, we can't decide that quite yet. But the image of this ewe lamb that's drinking from his cup and lying in his bosom is like a daughter to him is not more than a little creepy here, isn't it? But it's a symbolic story, as Polson notes. It makes the link with Saul's daughters who become David's wives, or with Michal, with David before David rises over Saul. Notice there's no wife in this story. It's the poor man, the ewe lamb, and a bunch of children. So we know nothing about the wife there. And then a strange thing happens. A traveler came to the rich man. And in everything else we see in the Bible, when a traveler comes to you, you should offer hospitality. And yet we've already seen in the background of this story, because of the perhaps sexual abuse of Bathsheba at the beginning, the echoes of other stories of sexual abuse, including the rape of the man's secondary wife or concubine in Judges 19 to 21, where we see precisely the refusal of hospitality to someone there, and the people like the people in Sodom who want to come out and, quote, know the visitors. So here, what will happen with the hospitality? A traveler comes to the rich man, and lo, there's not a good translation here of the Chamal. Falkman says he spared his own, but literally, as I translated over here, he had compassion or pity to take one of his own. So he has compassion or pity on his own flock, which is a very interesting thing, isn't it? That presumably your flock is there to eat for yourself or for others. And we don't know that the rich man has any special personal relationship with these animals. And yet we hear he has compassion or pity to not take from his own or to make. Both times it's translated prepare, here it's make. As Paulson notes below, it remains ambiguous what exactly the rich man does with the poor man's ewe lamb. However, it plainly means to kill it for human eating, but we don't hear that. And then we hear the second of three labels for the person who comes to visit. Again, not pronounceable without vowels, but it's linked directly to the story I just referenced earlier about the abuse of hospitality and of the secondary woman there, and that's the only other use of it in the Deuteronomistic history. Are we expected David knows those stories? Well, we just saw a reference to Judges 9 in Joab's message to David via the messenger, so Judges seems to be in play as something that people know the stories of. Whether they know it as the book of Judges or just supposed to know the stories isn't clear. And then we see the repeat of the phrase who had come to him. And we see it a couple times here, who had come to him, much like the repeat that Uriah would not go down to his own house that we saw in chapter 11. So we see that phrase twice here. It's literally the one going, and that's why going, the word for go or came here, is 3 times in this verse and also up here. And taking twice, which is covered over here. The taking here and the taking. He won't take of his own, but he'll take of this one, echoing plainly the taking of Bathsheba. But as my note below has, his article, unlike the reader, David does not have access to the narrator's connection between his taking of Bathsheba in 11:4 and the rich man taking the ewe lamb here in 12:4. Schipper suggests that if David, quote, if he understands the story as a parable about Uriah's murder, then the rich man who arranges the murder of the ewe lamb, which would be Uriah, to please the traveler would be the only other named character in 2 Samuel 11, General Joab. Well, that's one way to look at it. And plainly, Uriah is the one who's, the Bathsheba is the one who's taken. But people want to say Uriah is the ewe lamb because the ewe lamb is going to be killed and Bathsheba isn't killed. It's one example of how confusing this little story is if we try to make it a point-for-point allegory. And then finally, for the man who had come to him. Now, before we get to David's response, we'll look at next time, let's just consider something about this story in itself. In the narrative context, it comes out of nowhere. David has just taken Bathsheba into his house, and they have a baby who's there and who's going to die. And so presumably he's in a happy moment, and whether Bathsheba hears the story, we don't know. And David suddenly hears this story out of nowhere and doesn't have one hint has anything to do with him, and will fall directly into the trap when Nathan says, "You are the man," in verse 7. You can see it on the left side. I don't mean to have a spoiler alert, but there it is. But if you're Nathan and you want to help David come to grips with the fact that Yahweh has seen what he's done with Bathsheba and Uriah is evil and want it to come to his attention, why tell this kind of story? I'd like to suggest, following Paulson, that one of the reasons is this story becomes the master metaphor for the entire Deuteronomistic history. And let's look at it here. And so the yellow part here is the immediate plot. This is how we see it here. And I won't go over all these now, but notice how we can play out this little story allegorically, again, all of these circumstances. Let's just look at this example of how these are paired. Early in the days of David, Saul took Michal from David and gave David to Palti. And then exactly the other way around, when Palti, with his tail between his legs, goes crying after Abner and Michal are going to David, and he says, "Go home." And then we see it all the way down to the end on the other side, where David is the poor man from whom his women are all taken away. Tamar to Amnon, her half-brother, who rapes her. His concubines to Absalom, who attempts to usurp power through that symbolic act. And to Abishag, who Adonijah goes into exactly on the same basis as Absalom here, to suggest that I'm king now. But finally, just as in the beginning it followed the Israelites getting the land taken away from the Canaanites, here it's Israel, who's the poor man, has the land taken away and given to the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And Paulson notes this as the central metaphor of the entire Deuteronomistic history, but he doesn't play it out this way as I do here. So with that in mind, next time we're going to hear how David and Nathan respond to this, not necessarily following the story exactly, but allowing it to sit there and be played out as we see here throughout the rest of the history. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.